So as Bill mentioned, the Times recently did a story about the use of extensive surveillance in Ecuador, a system called ECU 911, and financed by loans in China, thousands of cameras around the country. It's become a bit of a political controversy there, but the story says that we reported that this has been deployed in 18 countries, ranging from the Middle East to Germany. I guess a question to all of you, are we seeing, the world basically divide up into, countries that are adopting these kind of surveillance technologies, courtesy of China, in many ways financed by China, and those who are not? And how worried are you about their spread?
I'm not necessarily wildly well equipped to give you a survey of the globe. I can certainly tell you that, we wrote about, Minky, help. We wrote about ZTE selling voice recognition software to the Ethiopian government, I think in 2013 or 2014, with the explicit goal of, training officials on how to use it to surveil conversations between the political opposition. And I think it will be very interesting to see how these kinds of investments play out, in jurisdictions that have very strong privacy rights and that have a free media and that have, independent professional legal systems where these debates can play out, and ones where, those institutions that can help defend privacy rights don't exist at all. But I also have to say, what you were just saying about iFlyTech prompts me to make the following point, which is that a lot of big Chinese tech companies are also giving money to or establishing partnerships with universities in the U.S., across Europe, and Australia. And iFlyTech has some sort of partnership with MIT's flagship computer science laboratory. And, I think some of those schools need to answer some questions about what the precise nature and parameters of those relationships are. And if they're at all uneasy about or even well informed about some of the abusive conduct some of those companies have been engaged in.
You're asking a question that is almost impossible to answer, but right now we're so linked to the Chinese in telecommunications and computing wise that they are stealing data from us. They can get into our systems. They stole 400 million names of travelers and their passports from Marriott Starwood. They stole 135 or 140 million names from Equifax, plus all their credit ratings. And they stole 20 million names from the Office of Personnel Management, government officials. They've also been stealing health records. So the question among American data people is, what are they doing with all this data? They obviously have developed very sophisticated data mining and data analysis techniques. The worst case scenario is that they could cross-reference these different databases and compile dossiers or files on key Americans that they want to know about. It's likely that they've completely penetrated the U.S. Navy. In the APT-10 case, they got 100,000 names of U.S. naval personnel that they didn't already have from the attack on the Office of Personnel Management. So once again, the Chinese capability of managing data globally has really exploded.
Tiff, you've written about different uses of technology, including migrants in China, and the sense how the migrant populations in some instances are being forced to return to their provinces. Does technology play a role in those areas as well? Are we seeing it's helped China leapfrog in many instances, but are we seeing other places where it's being used politically?
Yes. So actually, in the book that I do have coming out, I look a lot at the migrant worker population, and indeed many of them are starting to head home as the factories automate. In some cases, many cases being forced out of the larger cities. Technology, sort of an interesting thing to keep in mind about, and this includes the social credit system and also some of the more scary authoritarian technologies. The Chinese, I think it's fair to say the Chinese government has used it, borrowing a phrase from a professor of Chinese labor activism, used it in both a repressive way and a responsive way. So the technology they're doing, for example, the social credit system, they're actually increasingly trying to use it to deal with issues, these perennial problems that migrant workers have faced with wage arrears, not being paid by their bosses. So there's been an effort to try to use the social credit system to give demerits to factory bosses that don't pay workers. And they've been doing this. They've slowed down recently because the economy's not doing so well. So now they're like, go ahead and don't pay them if you don't have the money. But about a year and a half ago, this was a big push. If you look, and they do it through they'd even do it through the public security ministry. So if there would be a labor dispute and a protest, you have the police there, and they would gather a lot of information on all the participants. So some of it clearly intended repressive, punitive for the worker activists. Worker activists have found themselves punished in the social credit system where they don't have access. First of all, they can't get a job afterwards. Then they maybe try to start their own company. They also can't get loans. They can't register a company. I talked to worker activists who tried to become small entrepreneurs, then found that that was not possible. But again, on the other side, they were trying to punish the factory bosses for not actually paying these workers. So it's a weird sort of dual system there, and you can see that.
Is the social credit system operating at the provincial level, but not yet at the central government level? Are they developing it in different cities, in different provinces, in different tracts? What's the exact status? I hear conflicting reports.
So initially I think the State Council in 2014 laid out an action plan for the social credit system and was very open about it. Reward the good and punish the bad and change social behavior in the process. Then they sort of gave a mandate to cities to just run with it. There isn't a lot of clarity about how you're supposed, as a city official, how you're supposed to implement the social credit system in a particular jurisdiction. It is spreading. My understanding is it's still basically being managed at the municipal level. They did say by 2020 that they would have a national system. They didn't say how they define a national system. Most people I've spoken to think next year they're going to say, okay, here it is, 2020. Here's our next 5-year plan to continue to implement this.
You think they stole the algorithms from Equifax that have helped them do this, create this system?
I don't know. Yeah.
Along those lines, I see you nodding your head about the social credit systems. Are these? I mean, it is, as Tiff says. On one hand, it could be helpful to people, and China is in a position where it wants to be very ambitious and leapfrog its rivals, particularly in the tech world. But it also is very much keeping a score on people. How concerned are you about this beyond even the Xinjiang issue?
Well, I think, the theme has come up repeatedly and rightly today about, the fact that people have, ordinary individuals have very little ability to weigh into policies and politics and say what they do and don't want, and draw any sort of parameters or lines, around their lives and how the state engages them. I get very frustrated by, articles that say things like, well, Chinese people don't care about their privacy. Well, why would you logically expect people to value a right they've never had? That doesn't make any sense. And so in that sense, yes, I think we are quite worried about this because even if, you can see some ways in which the system could be beneficial, there's so much evidence to suggest that the state's uses of technology are really about control and that they have negative consequences, and there's really no way to circumscribe that or push back against it or really opt out. And I think as long as those prevailing conditions hold, I think the relative improvements are minimal and frankly chosen by the state, not by people.
Sophie, do you think that we could see widespread erosion of civil liberties and human rights around the world as the Chinese roll out these systems in more and more countries?
Well, I think it depends enormously on, which other governments you're talking about, and whether they're democratic, whether there's a free press, whether, you could imagine taking, a company to court for having violated your privacy rights, whether you've got privacy rights at all, right? I mean, I think the potential variations on this story are enormous.
I want to ask you all a couple questions about AI, and then open it up to all of you for questions. Bill, there's Kai-Fu Lee has written a book about China being the world's new superpower on AI, and the sheer scale and advantage that China enjoys because of the data that you mentioned before. This is something of great pride to the Chinese. The government, I think, has invested $600 billion, and meanwhile, the U.S. the government has not invested much at all. Couldn't this be, in some respects, a very good thing for China and the economy, and as well as present obvious drawbacks?
It's a double-edged sword. Kai-Fu Lee's point was very interesting. He said the Americans may have a number of visionaries and different types of AI, and they may be the ones who come up with some of the most original ideas, but in China they have hundreds of thousands of engineers who are pretty good. And if you take 100,000 pretty good engineers and put them up against one of these AI problems, and you have massive data sets that you can work with, and you have infinite government funding, you can make further progress than the Americans can. You can get ahead of the Americans. And so most of the experts I've talked to say the Chinese are on par with us in AI, if not ahead of us in certain respects, because they've used their population and the massive data sets that allow AI systems to be trained, the deep learning that occurs. So economically, the Chinese want to export these systems. They're starting to do that. So it's a big money maker for China. But the downsides, of course, are the ones about civil liberties and human rights, that these systems can be used to manipulate a huge amount of data and extract lessons from it about who are the good people and who are the bad people.
Tiff, what do you predict China will do with its AI prowess and ambitions?
I think I'm difficult to predict that. I would imagine we could see beneficial and very, very scary applications, and we're seeing those it appears to be in places like Xinjiang already. I do think it's interesting, and I heard this again referring back to this interview I did with iFlyTech. I do think it's good to remember, and maybe a lesson for our leaders in the U.S., how important government support is for these things. And particularly on AI, iFlyTech told me that the government at both the central level, the provincial level, city level, everyone has different programs in order to encourage AI, whether it's funding the kids that go in the university that want to study it, whether it's tax waivers if your company gets designated as doing something interesting in AI, or a myriad other kinds of benefits. They told me it's extremely important. They're also facing the same competition everywhere in the world for tech talent. Baidu competing with iFlyTech, and the iFlyTech told me we have two sources for competing for people. One is obviously recent graduates, and the other is poaching them from other agencies. That's a horrendously difficult competition. But it is key that the government continues to do what it's doing, the government at all levels, and support the development of this AI. I followed a lot the automation in the Chinese factories, and the role of the government at different levels in supporting that is tremendously important. They both fund the robot makers because they want to have an indigenous capability in making robots, and they've done very good and made a huge progress when Medea, a big company that was previously known for making air conditioners, bought KUKA, one of the world's largest robot companies, and a German, sort of the crown jewels of Germany. And we don't know how much money it's unclear how much of that was state loans and that. But again, on the robotics side, you've got huge subsidies for factories that replace workers with robots. They have a program called Replace Workers with Robots. They're pretty blunt. And big, huge subsidies if you are designated as a serious robotic maker.
back on AI just quickly. We in this country seem to have a view that it's dangerous and that there are ethical concerns, and the employees at Google didn't want to work on tools that might be used by the American military. In China, it's the exact opposite. They are gung-ho, enthusiastic. They are developing it as fast as they can and figuring out that if there are any ethical issues or moral issues, we'll figure that out later. But first, let's develop the tools. So there seems to be a divergence of attitude about it.
Let me just add one quick point, which is to say that I think this is an area, or some of these issues, particularly about, the variations from one place to the next, about legal systems or privacy rights, means that there is an enormous need for international law on some of these issues. So that, with a view towards setting some of the highest standards with robust protections rather than either, a race to the bottom or, a decision to sort of postpone those issues until after technology has already been developed and deployed in some places, to really horrific ends.
I would say that issue also came up and was discussed a lot earlier this year with the gene sequencing incident in China as well. So